Hello, and welcome to the first episode of A Bit of Bytes. I'm your host for today, Blake Evans. Today I'll be explaining the ins and outs of a typical home router, what they are, what they do, and the different parts inside of it. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So to start, there are 5 main pieces in your average home router: an access point, a DHCP server, a firewall, a DNS server, and an Ethernet switch. All an access point does is broadcast the network name, for example, my average family. This is technically called an SSID, which stands for Service Set Identifier. There are also these things called bands, the most common of which are 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. These are the frequencies at which the radio waves in the air oscillate per second. This is known as a hertz, or a cycle per second. So when a radio wave goes up and down once in a second, it's called a hertz, or a cycle per second. 1 gigahertz is equal to 1 billion cycles, or hertzes, per second. These two bands have 2.4 billion and 5 billion cycles per second, respectively. You may already know that 5 gigahertz is faster, but 2.4 has a longer reach. This is because 5 has to oscillate more times in a second, which uses more power than the slower oscillation of 2.4. This causes the frequency to be higher in 5, but the range to be lower. If you live in a larger city with a lot of buildings very close to each other, such as New York City, you may have noticed that the police sirens are a much lower frequency, pitch, than in the other parts of the world. This is due to the fact that lower frequencies are able to penetrate through more surfaces, making them easier to be heard from further away in big cities. Now, smaller towns have a much more traditional high-pitched siren because they don't need to pass through as many surfaces. They just need to be loud and distinct. Pretty interesting fact there. Without getting too much into detail, 5 gigahertz is faster because its channel spectrum, or group of slight variations in the exact broadcast frequency, have more play possible in them when compared to 2.4, which allows more bandwidth faster speeds. Alright, let's move on. So now, next thing we're going to talk about is the DHCP server. A DHCP server gives out what are called IP addresses to all clients on a network. An IP address is essentially the street address of the computer. So if computers need to talk to one another, it connects through its IP address. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, which is actually a pretty good descriptor of what it does. It gives out dynamic IP addresses, meaning they can change from day to day to a host, to a computer. I'll give a pretty simple explanation as to what a firewall is. It basically just blocks bad things from getting onto your local network, and if configured properly, can even filter outgoing traffic in such ways as blocking specific websites. You may see this at your school. The fourth part of a home router is a DNS server. Typically, a home router just forwards an external DNS server to all of its clients on the local network. Simply put, DNS is the phone book of the internet. It allows you to type in, for example, impendingfailure.com instead of 104.31.64.68. When you type in a website address, it asks your home router for the IP address of the remote server that you're requesting data from. Your home router then forwards the request to a much larger DNS server, such as Google's public DNS 8.8.8.8 or Cloudflare's 1.1.1.1. This server tells your computer what remote IP address to pull data from. Your computer does it, and voila, you have a website on your screen. The fifth and final part is an Ethernet switch. This allows you to plug one Ethernet cable into your router and have multiple ports to plug in your wired devices to. Before the invention of the network switch, people used what were called network hubs. These work similarly to a switch, but manage data much less efficiently. Hubs worked by blasting the data throughout all the ports, and it was up to your computer to figure out what was meant for it and what wasn't. A switch intelligently and automatically determines all of this stuff by itself and takes some of the load off your computer. Thank you for watching this episode of Bit of Bytes, and I'll see you next time.